Readers, listeners, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You have to laugh because it seems like some of the episodes that are most popular with all of you listeners are the episodes where, in fact, you don't have to have read anything before listening. If that's you, welcome. So glad you're here. I don't care if you read or not. I just hope you're enjoying what you're listening to. So today we're going to be talking about a kind of a unique situation. It's kind of an interesting situation for me. Emma Cline's The Guest is one of these books that's getting a lot of buzz right now. And I had not read The Girls, which was the other book that she wrote. And I have to say, I was not particularly interested in Emma Cline until I started noticing, thanks to my daughter, that there is this real kind of lumping together of Eve Babitz, Emma Cline, and Joan Didion. Less so Joan Didion, but certainly the first two. And I was like, dude, anybody who's being lumped in with Eve Babitz and Joan Didion, like, let me at it. And honestly, I started reading The Guest, and I was so frustrated, and I was so just really like off-put. And I will say that it is not in the spirit of the Fox Page to, just bring a book out here so I can just like shit on it. But I will say that this was not a book that I loved. It was not. Oddly, it was a book that I was very compelled to finish. I was really interested in how she was going to do this. Which was an interesting thing for me. Oftentimes, it is not the plight of the character that makes me read on, and it's not sort of like, how is the author going to end this, and how are we going to wrap things up plot-wise? But in this case, I just was like, I don't understand. Like, is she just going to sustain this? And what's going to happen at the end? And how is she going to close it? I had heard that the ending was unsatisfying for certain people. I actually thought the ending was one of the best parts of the book. But aside from the fact that I was like a little bit, I was just kind of dismayed. I mean, honestly, it was a bummer. And I listened to a couple of interviews too with Emma Cline, and didn't feel a lot better about the book, and started thinking a lot about how, especially on Book Talk, which is kind of a vein of TikTok, on how this young writer is being lumped in with Eve Babitz. And I honestly just like couldn't rest until I had come up with a lecture for you all about I blocked her name, Emma Cline and Eve Babitz and Joan Didion. So we're going to dive into a little bit of an analysis that actually turned out to be so fruitful and so interesting to me, both as a reader and also as a Californian and as a woman, and as someone who's really invested in prose and also really invested with the way that young women see themselves in literature. I think that was the most alarming thing to me, is thinking that young women, much in the way that young women go through kind of like a Sylvia Plath, kind of period, or even a Virginia Woolf period. I mean, I think there are certain writers that really resonate with young women and help them sort of figure out who they're going to be in the world and help them navigate the world outside of their experience. Joan Didion is certainly one of those people. Not only is she an incredible writer, but she's become, a style icon and someone with an incredible cult following. So I think there is this sense in these young women writers, in select young women writers, where people are really sort of projecting themselves onto these women and trying to sort of figure out how to understand the world through the prose of these women, which again was part of the reason why I was a bit alarmed after I read The Guest by Emma Cline. So part of what I want to do today here is talk about the different ways that those three writers have very much in common. And I think ultimately what I'm trying to do here is convince you that you should go read Eve Babitz. Really, I'm going to just put the argument right up straight, right at the front. Read Emma Cline for sure if you want to, but when you're lumping the two of them together, or you see other people do, keep in mind that Emma Cline and Eve Babitz are very, very different beasts when it comes to the important aspects of their writing. We're going to talk first about the structure of each of three novels. So these are the novels that Emma Cline's The Guest made me think of, and they're kind of the books that these other two writers are best known for. So we're going to look at The Guest in comparison with Eve Babitz's Slow Days, Fast Company, which isn't exactly a novel, but that's part of the beauty of it. It's fairly close to a novel, and Eve Babitz has lots of nonfiction, as does Joan Didion. So I wanted to make sure that I was comparing apples to apples here. So we'll be looking at Emma Cline's The Guest, Eve Babbitt's Slow Days, Fast Company, and then, of course, we will be looking at Joan Didion's seminal Play It As It Lays. Play It As It Lays is her first novel. Actually, sorry, it's not her first novel. That was Run River, which I actually thought was better. It was about Sacramento. It's amazing. Play It As It Lays is not my favorite Joan Didion. In fact, it's not even like my top 3 of her novels. I really love Book of Common Prayer. I really love Democracy. I really love After Henry. There are a bunch of, After Henry is nonfiction, but there are a bunch of sort of lesser Didion that I think are better than some of the kind of best known. But Play It As It Lays is an incredible accomplishment, and I want to take a look at those 3 novels. They have so much in common. So all 3 of them are really invested in this kind of idea of a place. And in the case of Didion and Babitz, it's Los Angeles for both of them. And with Emma Cline, it is the Hamptons. I think it's East Hampton where she is. So we have this kind of split because they're not all 3 set in Los Angeles. That would just be like ultra tidy. But there is so much in common with kind of Hollywood and kind of the social stratum in which Babitz and Didion are sort of functioning, that is in common with the world that Emma Cline is taking a close look at in the East Hamptons. This is very privileged, very moneyed people, but in all cases, the women are looking at sort of a few different layers of the social fabric. A tiny bit less so in Didion. Everyone there is kind of, upper crusty Hollywood, producers and that sort of thing. But certainly in Babitz and also in Emma Cline, you do have a little more kind of, venturing into different social milieu. But in all 3 of these cases, you're talking about, very sort of upper crusty, summery kind of settings. In fact, Emma Cline, it's all over the course of 1 week, and it is at the end of August, right up to Labor Day. So you certainly have a summery feel, partly by dint of these other 2 books just simply being set in Los Angeles, but then they do all have kind of a same, sense of summertime and a sense of heat and a sense of sunshine and a sense of things being overly bright. There are lots of swimming pools and lots of ocean in all of these books. So, but more importantly, in each of them, we have a young woman who's sort of at the center of this book. And that young woman is someone who is relatively independent, not to say totally lonely and alienated, which, both of those things are sort of, it's a thin line in these women's cases, in the protagonists' cases, between loneliness and independence, or alienation and independence. Something else that they all share is that each of them is invested in sort of one man, but each of them have these, the novels are very much taken up with this kind of episodic structure where each of these women, who is young, they're all in their 20s, and they all are having various different sexual experiences with various different men. So in many ways, they follow kind of the same pattern in that each of them has these different forays with these different men. So a third thing that they all have in common is the fact that all of them have quite a bit of drug use in them, not to say abuse. And they take kind of different tacks when it comes to the drug use. And that is something that we're going to take a look at because both their use of these substances and then also their attitude toward them really says very much about the sort of different, emphases that these books are putting forward. Again, another reason why I'm slightly worried about, the 20-year-old that's being portrayed in 2023. That is a perfect segue into one of the ways in which these 3 books are very different. So you have, the Guest came out, I think, in 2023, maybe 2022. I'm doing this without notes today. I'm just riffing. I'm going. So hopefully I won't say anything that's just like wrong, but I'm fairly certain it was 2023, if not 2022. Play It As It Lays was published, now I'm getting myself into a little bit of hot water. 1970. I'm going to go back and check that and make sure that's correct. And I believe that Slow Days, Fast Company came out in 72. So both Play It As It Lays and Slow Days, Fast Company are very much invested in the end of the 60s and the early 70s. And they're both in Los Angeles. So you have kind of a similar historical moment. And that's actually very important. In The Guest, it is 2023. The novel seems to, be concerned with a week that is in this decade. There's not a strong sense of this being, the early 2020s. Whereas in both the Didion and the Babitz, you really do have a strong sense of a political environment, certainly in the Didion, but a sense of things really coming apart, and a sense of the sort of fabric of the United States being really challenged in some different ways. And in Didion, there's a lot of concern for this, and you have throughout the entire work, you have this real sense of things not going well. And the book does span from New York City to Nevada to California. So in Play It As It Lays, you have this real concern for kind of all of American humanity. And the same thing a little bit in the Babitz, in Slow Days, Fast Company. She's certainly less concerned, but you definitely have a sense of this as being set in a certain moment. This is probably a good time to take a quick break and let you know that the Didion and Babitz comparison has been around forever. And I loved that in the introduction to one of her books, Eve Babbitt said something like she was thanking, or it was the acknowledgments, she was thanking the Didion Dunns, who is Joan Didion and John Dunn. She thanked them for essentially being the LA residents that Eve Babbitt did not have to be. Joan Didion and John Dunn, who were not native to Los Angeles, Didion is from Sacramento, which is much more conservative, and John Dunn is from the Northeast. You have them as these sort of moralizers. You have them as people who are saying everything that's happening in Los Angeles at the end of the 60s and early 70s is not great. And there is all sorts of, entropy, and things are falling apart, and the center will not hold, and everything is really just going to shit. Whereas Eve Babbitt is just enjoying herself. So there's this nice kind of interplay that everyone acknowledged, which is that Eve Babbitt and Joan Didion were portraying, relatively independent young women who were not married and not sort of happily domesticated. And yet, in Didion's case, this woman is very unhappy in that situation, whereas Eve Babbitt seems to really thrive in a milieu that is allowing for lots of drugs and lots of sex and lots of rock and roll, really. So you have this very clear sense of the two California novels as being heavily sort of set at the end of the 60s, early 70s, whereas the Cline novel is kind of floating in its own world and is a little bit less tethered to a certain era, certainly in terms of politics and sort of the wider world. Okay, so now that we have kind of an overview of these three novels, and we have talked a bit about what they all share, this idea of an independent woman, the idea of substances, drugs and drinking certainly being a very important part of, from start to finish of all three of these, and lots of sexual exploration, and this idea of young women who are engaging in a lot of different sexual experiences with different men, all to sort of happier and less happier degrees. But the structure of the novels, I think, is one way to really appreciate the different, honestly, I think it's going to just help you understand why, in part, with The Guest, I just was like, ugh. That was maybe a little bit strong. But I was just, there's a certain amount of repetition in The Guest. And because I had read the Didion and the Babitz, and I have a template in my mind for this kind of, this kind of novel with this kind of, drug-using, very beautiful young woman who is engaging in different sexual exploration, I had a, certain expectations for the complexity maybe in the structure or the richness of the prose. And you do get complexity and richness in both Babitz and Didion, and I just didn't see it in The Guest. So In the guest, we have a young woman named Alex, and we have this week-long trajectory. She is in the Hamptons. We don't really have much information about her backstory. The one thing that comes up again and again and again is that this guy, Dom, is after her. And we're not really sure why until some point in the novel. And I'm not going to spoil everything for you, but you have Alex, who is she's out east in East Hampton, I believe, with this guy named Simon. And essentially some bad things happen. And he says, you're no more welcome here. But she gets it in her head that instead of going back to the city, she is going to hang out and come back to his Labor Day party. So then we have this kind of episodic, sexual adventures that are all from the beginning. From the first page, she's using pills and she's drinking a lot. I think they're just painkillers. And it's not excessive, she doesn't seem like out of her mind in most of these cases, and yet you do start to wonder a little bit. So, and then at the the whole trajectory is her kind of moving through a couple of different experiences with different people, not all of them sexual and not all of them men, but she has these kind of adventures as she tries to stay in the Hamptons with no money for a week with the goal of going back to Simon's party. And again, you have the threat of this Dom guy the whole time. So it's over the course of 1 week. It's all very, I guess you could argue that these are some nice classical unities in that classical unities coming from drama, back in Greece, like Aristophanes or Euripides, those kinds of people. And in those cases, it had to be 3 acts. It had to all happen within 24 hours, and it had to happen in the same space. So like everything happened in the Forum, or everything happened on the island, or whatever it was. And you have some of those unities, but in this case, they didn't quite add enough. And oftentimes having a story that is simply told chronologically, chronology, if you're a writer, chronology is your friend. So I don't have a problem with Emma Cline having written this in chronological order. It's a very straightforward third-person narrator who is telling us what Alex is doing, predominantly with Simon in mind and always with the threat of Dom. So it's a very kind of straightforward situation, and that was part of my thinking. I was like, is this what we're gonna get for, I think it's probably 250 pages? The standard novel is. It felt kind of like a standard novel length. It was just very sort of straightforward. And I think when we look at these next 2 books, you'll have a sense of what maybe my expectations might have been, or how cool these other models that are very similar are. So the next one I want to look at is Slow Days, Fast Company, because the structure is so incredible. So right from the beginning, Eve Babitz tells us that what she's writing here is a love story, but she doesn't expect it to go well. So, don't have that expectation in mind. And essentially that she is going to write this letter, this kind of love, manuscript for this person that she is in love with, and the person is not paying attention to her and won't read what she writes unless she has kind of mentions of him and things that will be interesting to him throughout. So essentially she tells us at the beginning in this incredibly funny and heartfelt and real and pathetic in the best way, like meaning it brings up some pathos for us. This very kind of upfront, vulnerable letter about how she's gonna tell us all of these different tales, and intermixed, she's going to have these italicized chunks that are really addressed to this lover. So we have much the same sort of episodic thing that we have in the Emma Cline, in that we have Eve Babitz. They're separated into much more kind of like discrete chapters. Each has a title. Each does have an italicized part that is so charming, where she's addressing this person who is not named. We don't know who this person is. And throughout the book, she's mentioning several different men that she's with. There's someone named Frank D. There's an Irish writer from San Francisco. There is somebody named Larry. There are all sorts of different people. And there's one guy named Graham who seems to be kind of someone she's still pining after. There's a guy named Sean. There are all these different people who she is with. And they're all kind of you have this idea that it's all in the auspices of making this other person jealous. It's such a great structure because it's loose and it allows for this kind of episodic thing, but it's very smart too. It also allows for much more range. So we have adventures that happened to her when she was younger, things that happened to her when she's older. We move from Rome to Mexico to Bakersfield to Tehachapi to Taos. So you have all of these different, this sort of breadth that the guest just does not have. I will say, and there are definitely some good things to say about the guest, and I will get there a bit later. And there's some really great evocation of social class and of like some of the really awful kind of milieu that she's kind of, I think, justifiably sort of repelled by, but also really wanting to be part of it, which is problematic, like very invested in becoming part of it. Whereas Eve Babitz, I think, is a little more savvy. Eve Babitz was born in Hollywood and went to Hollywood High School, and I think was disillusioned appropriately when she was very, very young. She had this super interesting thesis that she brings up. So one of the things Eve Babitz is known for are these incredible aphorisms. So she'll say just literally, they're like 3 on a page. It's incredible. These kind of truisms that are so funny and so like true that I literally could devote all of the Foxed page just to like an Eve a day, a Babitz a day, because these things are so wise and so funny. One of them is this kind of theory that she has that back in the day, all of the kind of the people who were sort of, like objectively / stereotypically beautiful all went out to Hollywood in order to be in the movies at the very beginning, in the early 20th century, and that all the really smart people stayed in the East Coast to do all the banking. And that's why you have places like Hollywood High School where literally everyone is beautiful. So if you have ever been to Los Angeles and you've ever gone to some of these places like Erewhon, which is a grocery store, or the Whole Foods in Santa Monica, I mean, these places literally you feel like you're in a movie set because everyone is so effortlessly beautiful. I mean, there are other reasons for this, but that was a little aside that I found very interesting on the part of Babitz. Are we offended for the East Coast? No, those people get to be smart. I mean, which is better, really? I mean, I think it's pretty clear. We all want to be smart. Okay. Back to the task at hand here. So Slow Days Fast Company has this incredibly interesting, incredibly flexible, but also very original and interesting structure where we have the idea of this kind of love letter that she is writing. It's a love letter to the man. It's also absolutely a love letter to Los Angeles. And she's very upfront about the idea that this is a love letter to Los Angeles, which again adds this whole layer of value. And she's also very clear about the shortcomings of Los Angeles, which is awesome. She's very vulnerable in the book in lots of ways. We see the Emma Cline protagonist also as being vulnerable, but not in like a self-knowing, self-aware way, but more in sort of this closed off, claustrophobic, like train wreck kind of way. So you have in Slow Days Fast Company, you have this really interesting structure. So the third case, Play It As It Lays, I saved that for last because it has arguably the most complex structure. So I think what people remember when they think of Play It As It Lays is Mariah and sort of the nihilism. Oh my gosh, guys, big thing. For those of you who have listened to any other Foxed Page podcast where I have mentioned nihilism, I have been pronouncing it incorrectly my entire life. I don't know who to blame that on. Maybe I'll blame that on, I don't know. Actually, I'm not going to blame it on anyone. I'll blame it on myself. It is nihilism. So there is a lot of nihilism that we have in Play It As It Lays, but it's a much broader and much wider sort of scope. So I think people will remember Mariah and the nihilism and the darkness and the drug use and sort of like yuck. Like you do have a sense of the book as being very dark. But it is a classic for a reason, and the reason is because the structure is incredible and the prose is incredible. And also, I believe it's a classic because it's a very good encapsulation of that period in time of Hollywood and of the shortcomings and of the way that women were treated so badly. Both Eve Babitz and Didion are very clear about women's issues, and I think both of those novels, I mean, Didion is a little harder to argue with this exact novel, but Eve Babitz, it's an absolute feminist treatise. I mean, she has some of these aphorisms that I mentioned earlier have to do with how difficult it is to be a woman. At one point, she talks about all the really beautiful waitresses in this one, I don't know if it's like the Polo Lounge or if it's Ports or wherever this is, but it's some storied Los Angeles restaurant. And she hopes that these beautiful waitresses are going to poison all of the gross men in there who are making their crude remarks and all of their sweethearts and honeys and whatnot, which is so prescient because, you know, this is 1970. Not that people didn't know this then, but she was speaking out against stuff that later, I mean, literally only recently, has really become a national conversation. Okay, but back to Didion and this incredibly complex structure that she has. So we have some similarities. We have Mariah at the beginning, and she is concerned with sort of one love. She was married to someone when she lived in New York, and then she is married to a man named Carter. And she and Carter have a 4-year-old child, and it turns out she is pregnant. She doesn't actually know if it's Carter's child or this other less good one who is this lover that she's had recently. So you have, much like in the Emma Cline book, where we have our protagonist Alex, who's with this guy Simon, you have this Mariah character who's very invested in this one person. Also the same way that the Babitz protagonist is interested in this one unnamed lover to whom the whole novel is addressed. But in Didion, you have, again, the same kind of episodic stuff where you have her with several different lovers. At one point, she goes and has an abortion. At one point, there's a lot of stuff about her driving in Los Angeles, a lot of really beautiful stuff about Los Angeles as a whole. But you have, honestly, I could talk for hours and hours about the foliage. And Emma Cline does some great foliage. She does some very good descriptions of the ocean and a sense of place in the East. But I will still say, does not hold a candle to the way that Eve Babitz talks about jacarandas. It's just, she's unbelievable. I mean, she's just so good. Or the Santa Anas, or, these other sort of natural forces that are so predominant in Los Angeles. But back to our Joan Didion structure. The structure itself, it begins with a chapter that is told from the first person perspective from Mariah. Then we have 3 chapters that are told in the first person perspective from 3 of the kind of ensemble characters. They're not minor characters, but they're not Mariah. You have Mariah, then you have these 3 characters, and then it shifts into a third person narration. So if you heard me talk about narration and point of view in podcasts, you'll know that I like a shifting narrator if it's consistent all the way throughout. I think there's lots of logic to that. Sometimes it can feel like a bit of a cheat, but in lots of ways it does give us a very, it allows for us to enter into the minds of many different people. And so we can form kind of a complete picture of everyone and all of their, complementary perspectives on one another, on each other. Quick tip, one another is if it's 2 people, each other is if it's many people. So like if you were going to say, hey, let's get together and have coffee, I want to, we can hang out with one another. That's a one-on-one thing. But each other is like, hey guys, we should all get coffee. We can hang out with each other. Quick little tip for you. But you have these 4 first-person chapters, and then it gives way to this third-person narration. I think it works actually well. You can break any rules you want if you can get away with them, and Didion is very good at breaking rules and getting away with them. But even this idea that she is breaking rules and has this very sort of complex structure is really speaking to the ways in which the scope of the novel and the voices in the novel and the sort of texture of the novel, to my mind, is much more complicated and much more interesting and much broader and richer and deeper than Emma Cline. So I want to wrap up this kind of discussion of the structure of these three books by saying that the structures are very different. Obviously, you have like a very straightforward week-long chronological third-person narrator with Emma Cline's The Guest. With Eve Babitz, you have this really textured, sort of almost like a short story collection, but with this incredible cohesion and this incredible sense the whole time that you're sort of remembering that she's recounting all of these episodes that are full of joy and love and fun with these other men, in large part to make this, the recipient of this manuscript, to make this other person jealous. So it sort of adds a whole layer of, of nuance in a way that is, I just think it's just genius. So there's a complexity there that we simply don't have in The Guest. And then Play It As It Lays, again, you have this structure that is very, it's very complicated and I think is doing very important things with its complexity. So the thing that I will come back to is that there is a certain nihilism. We're saying nihilism now and not nihilism. There is a certain sort of nihilism and despair and a kind of narrowing of life and possibilities in The Guest. And in some ways, you have the same sort of thing happening in Play It As It Lays. It doesn't happen in Eve Babitz because Babitz is the one who's having fun in the midst of everything. And Joan Didion is the one who's seeing, the darkness and the despair. So in some ways, Emma Cline is closer to Didion in terms of tone. Again, this kind of despair and this kind of almost claustrophobic sense of like nowhere to go. You've burned all the bridges. Really, and an important thing, and you know this right from the beginning of Play It As It Lays, is that Mariah is writing from a mental institution. She's writing from a mental hospital in Los Angeles. So you do have a frame there in sort of the same way with The Guest, where the whole thing comes full circle in some ways, although the ending is more hopeful in the Didion. And if your ending is more hopeful in Play It As It Lays, then I think that says something about the level of nihilism and despair and narrowing and claustrophobia in The Guest. So I want to just kind of pull back a little bit and bring this whole thing full circle myself, which is that this idea of young women lumping these three writers together, I think in some ways makes lots of sense. There are lots of commonalities in the sort of in this mix here, and all of it is compelling. But if we're thinking about these writers who are all writing about women in their young 20s, their young adulthood, where women are really sort of identifying with them and using them as ways to sort of learn how to navigate the world, or at least are being very sort of absorbed in these worlds and finding them fascinating, I would rather, frankly, have everybody reading the Eve Babitz. And we're going to go on and talk some more in the sense of place and the general tone that will add to my argument. But I will say, even just given the structure, if you're going to read about someone in her 20s, there just is a lot more interesting prose and a lot more interesting structure than you will get in The Guest. All of that said, I also will remind you that I finished The Guest. I mean, I kind of couldn't tear myself away. Partially, I was wanting to just get it over with, but also I was genuinely curious. It wasn't that I was invested in the outcome of this. I wasn't concerned necessarily about Alex. I didn't feel for her, but it was like a car crash, like watching a train wreck, I couldn't look away. I was rubbernecking. There are lots of things that I think explain why The Guest is popular, but my sense is that don't be too quick to lump these all together, or lump them together in some sort of recommendation in your mind, and then read the Babitz, and then read the Didion, and then maybe read The Guest. Okay, I want to move on and talk a little bit about the quality of prose in these three books. And you all know how much I invest in the first sentence and in the first paragraph of any given book. I think that it's very telling that even the first sentences of these books, of these three books, is kind of enough to really give us a sense of the disparity in terms of richness and complexity and sort of how much you're going to get out of this prose. So I'm going to begin with the Emma Cline. It's a beautiful cover. I mean, I just like, who doesn't want to read that book? Although having read it, I'm looking at that hand and I'm like, ooh, like, what is she dead? Like, it's like, it looks like that. If you can't picture it, the hand, it's this really bright lime green with really bright blue, and the hand, it could either be a hand, it's kind of palm up. It could either be like reaching out for something, like maybe help, or it could literally be empty and dead. Up to you. Up to you. Okay, but we're going to read the very first line of this novel to get a sense of the prose. This was August. The ocean was warm and warmer every day. So I will be the first to say that Emma Cline's writing is fine. It's totally good. Like, there's nothing. There were a couple of things. There were a couple very minor things that I did in fact mark, but for the most part, the prose was good. It was clear, and she doesn't get in her own way, and there are not a lot of like overwrought metaphors. Like, she's the writing is very good. The writing is good. I think her use of description when she describes people, I think her choice of detail is excellent. The writing itself is great. It's very stripped down and kind of numb in a way that I think is very telling. It's very appropriate that our third person narrator here is very kind of distant and I think numb. I think numb might not be a bad word. I'm going to repeat that first sentence. This was August. The ocean was warm and warmer every day. So again, I think that's great. Emma Cline also has this really nice motif with water. There's a lot of water in this book. This Alex is like swimming every chance she gets. And whether it's in a gross swimming pool or whether it's in a pristine swimming pool or whether it's the ocean, you always have a sense of these watery expeditions as, having to do with cleansing or rebirth or literally like amniotic fluid kind of a thing. I mean, there's a lot of really beautiful use of water throughout the entire novel. So that is something I can really compliment. So this was August. I can now repeat it without looking. This was August. That's the first line of the book. In fact, that line that I read, the ocean was warm, getting warmer every day. I was just paraphrasing in case I made a mistake there. That's the whole first paragraph. And you do have, again, the prose is very spare and very straightforward. So now we are moving on to the Joan Didion Play It As It Lays from 1970. It's interesting. I was gonna skip over the first sentence, but I'm gonna read it here because it does add to the complexity. The first sentence of Play It As It Lays famously is, "What makes Iago evil? Some people ask, I never ask." So Didion came under quite a bit of fire because young Mariah is not particularly educated, and she's not particularly someone who is attending Shakespeare, productions in Los Angeles. And she is not someone who, I don't think she was a model in New York City. I'm not sure that she did a lot of Shakespeare in her education. So this question of what makes Iago evil, some people ask, I never ask. People found that a bit of a strange foot to begin on because it doesn't quite gel with the rest of the information we have about Mariah. However, this book is wildly successful and has been a touchstone for many, many people and is incredibly well done. And she gets away with that kind of, a slight sort of jarring detail that we are given here because the rest of it is so strong. But listen to this next sentence, which in some ways, that's one paragraph, the one about Iago. It's two very short sentences. Then we get into a much longer paragraph that, to my mind, is kind of the true start of the book. Which is, that is a hot take, people, because a lot of people really dig into this Iago thing and the nature of good and evil. And yes, this whole book is about the nature of good and evil. But my sense is that we know that with this next sentence, which is actually amazing. Okay, so this is the second paragraph after this very short paragraph in Play It As It Lays. Another example, one which springs to mind because Mrs. Burstein saw a pygmy rattler in the artichoke garden this morning and has been intractable ever since. I never ask about snakes. So I love this. So I think that she could have gotten rid of the Iago thing and just gone to this snake thing. Those of you who have listened to the podcast know that anytime you hear about a snake or an apple or a tree, you really need to think of the Garden of Eden. You need to think about, the fruit of knowledge. You need to think about the fact that when they ate from that fruit of knowledge, that what they realized was that they were naked and that they were not innocent, and that they had, that there was something wrong with them. They were not born with goodness. So right away, you have this vision of snakes, and this idea of snakes repeats throughout in a very beautiful motif throughout Play It As It Lays, and in fact throughout a lot of Didion. But this idea of a pygmy, so Mrs. Burstein saw a pygmy rattler, I'm gonna say it like that, rattler, in the artichoke garden this morning, and has been intractable since. I never ask about snakes. There is so much information here. We have this very specific Mrs. Burstein. A pygmy rattler sounds like extra scary, just because you've got, I think baby snakes are always, well, I don't know, this is not a baby, maybe it sounds like a whole different thing, but like, this is a narrator who knows about different types of rattlesnakes. She, in fact, goes on to talk about different markings and different venoms and all these different things. Like, she's an expert in snakes, which is so rad, because that's the kind of thing, like Didion, she's an expert in snakes because snakes are also men. Like, snakes are, it's phallic, but also, like, it's literally a word you'd be like, oh, he was such a snake. Not so much anymore. But in the 60s, it's like saying he was like a, I don't know. I can't think of an example right now, but like, a dastardly fella. Okay. So you have this beginning that is this idea that's very complicated. It turns out that Mrs. Burstein is someone who is taking care of her in the mental hospital, and the artichokes are supremely Californian. It's really a nod to the Central Valley. It's a nod to California as being kind of one of the big bread baskets of the United States, and as being sort of this incredible productive land. But also, an artichoke is a thistle. An artichoke, it's very difficult to grow. Well, not out in those big fields in California. Apparently you can grow anything, but there is this sense of an artichoke as being very kind of rarefied and very Californian. Rattlesnakes also is a very Western thing. So you have all of this complexity in this very first sentence that tells us so much about Mariah, whereas the idea of this was August, the ocean warm, getting warmer every day, really, it's just not, it doesn't have the same richness of this kind of prose. Okay, we're gonna move on to check out the richness of the prose in this book right here, which is Slow Days, Fast Company. I was losing the thread, I got it back. Okay, here's the opening of Eve Babitz, Slow Days, Fast Company. This is a love story, and I apologize. It was inadvertent. But I want it clearly understood from the start that I don't expect it to turn out well. So even the very beginning of this, and the punctuation is incredible. So this is a love story, and I apologize. Then we have a semicolon. That is so funny. This is a love story, and I apologize. So first of all, it's a first-person narration, and you have, right away, you have a certain amount of intimacy, because a first-person narration implies that the reader is you. So you have I and you. The narrator here is really directly addressing us. I apologize. It's also, it's a bit of a hackneyed expression, but it is a well-worn kind of way that we communicate. So there's kind of this open, chatty, kind of conversational tone at the beginning. But it's also so funny that she's apologizing for telling a love story. So you have this kind of wry humor and this kind of, a certain amount of snarkiness and a certain amount of kind of irony, but it's also funny. So there's this kind of levity right from the start. And then you have the semicolon, it was inadvertent. So we don't know exactly what she's referring to here. I have spent so much time thinking about this. It was inadvertent can mean, for example, part of me wonders, editorially, did she have a bunch of episodic kind of short stories that all happen to be about men, and then she's like, wait, I can actually turn these into a love story, and I can make it with this frame, which you might think that that's manipulative, but that actually is delightful in my mind, because it works. I think it's very compelling the way that she has done it here. But this, it was inadvertent, could mean that, in the sense that, like, she didn't set out to write a love story, but maybe as she's telling each of these episodes, she can only be thinking about, this other guy. So you have this sense of mystery and intrigue about why this was inadvertent. You also have a sense of everything is being inadvertent, meaning the telling of the love story is inadvertent, the falling in love is inadvertent, the way things are going to go is inadvertent. So all of these, like valences, all of these different nuances are very intentional, and I think are very well said. And then the next line, but I want it clearly understood from the start that I don't expect it to turn out well. So you have right from the beginning here, you have, again, it can be construed as kind of a nihilism and sort of a despair. And, when we begin The Guest with Emma Cline, it tells us right on the copy, the flap copy, that she's going to be kicked out of this house. So we know right from the start that in The Guest, things are not going to go well either. And certainly at the beginning of Play It As It Lays, once we realize that she is in a mental hospital, we also have a sense of things not having gone well in her love life. So in each of these cases, you have this idea of these people, these young women who are coming up against difficult circumstances in their love lives. And yet with Eve Babitz and with the Didion, we have this kind of broader, more complex, more upfront, we know much more about these narrators right from the jump. It's just so much richer in so many ways. Okay, the next thing that I want to take a look at is the sense of place in all of these novels. So I think, again, Babitz and Didion are lumped together largely because of the Los Angeles connection. But I think you also can argue that all three of them can be kind of lumped together, partially because of the kind of summary kind of vibes in all of these books, but also because of the social milieu. I mean, these are very much the, the rich and beautiful and semi-famous and, certainly the ultra-wealthy. All of these books are criticizing, to a certain extent, the ultra-wealthy. But they do have a very, all of them share, I think, a very vivid sense of place. And it's one of the things that Emma Cline does best. In the novel, she has some great descriptions of the ocean. She has some great descriptions of places, like people's homes, and how, all of these giant houses on the fancy parts of Long Island seem sort of institutional because they all are somewhat generic, and the scale is so large. And so she has some really great description. There's really good description of kind of an old beach club, and how in some ways it's kind of shabby, but how genteel that is. Really, she's a very good observer of social dynamics and of these different kinds of, subtle ways that people are, and very unsubtle ways in which people kind of recognize each other or see, different people as sort of members of different social strata. Okay, but she also has some really beautiful descriptions of the trees. And when I think of the Hamptons, I think of that movie. I'm gonna forget the name of it. It's with Diane Keaton. I love all those Diane Keaton movies. And like, there's a lot of people driving through very green spaces and then driving up into big giant houses. So this is kind of the Hamptons that I recognized from a Nancy Meyers movie. Was also very well depicted here in The Guest. All the back roads looked the same. Trees meeting overhead, making a hollow cut by the occasional driveway. Roads lined by the same deep summer green packed so tight you couldn't see anything beyond. The houses were hidden behind hedges and gates, offering no navigable landmarks. So I like the use of navigable. I like what this is saying here. This idea of this green as packing in so tightly. I mean, there's a certain kind of resonance with money, with money being green, but also this sense of hedges and walls and gates and not being allowed, and in fact, not even being able to see, into the world of the ultra wealthy. All of that is so beautifully done here. And there is, Didion and Babitz both, have lots of really great vocabulary. We saw it in the very beginning, and by great vocabulary, I mean very effective, but often it's very sort of, it's kind of sophisticated. In this case, you have this nice range, everything from the beginning of the guest, where we have, this was August, and then you have this idea of this navigable terrain. So I really think that Cline does a good job with the sense of place, and I think it's one of the strong points of the novel. You can guess what I'm going to do now, though. I will say that I think that both in the Didion and the Babitz, partially because you have a much wider scope, both chronologically and also in terms of geographies and in terms of time, then you I would argue have a much sort of richer sense both of the place itself, because with the Babitz, for example, she's able to, she's in Bakersfield and she's in Laguna Beach and she's in these different places in Los Angeles, giving us a sense of the region in a way where, and, Emma Cline's book is meant to feel very claustrophobic. So it's meant to feel very kind of all the same. And you certainly have beautiful vistas with the ocean in this in the guest, and that is contrasted very nicely with all of the trees and whatnot. But I would still argue that the Didion and the Babitz are still more effective in terms of evoking a sense of place and the kind of ultra wealthy that they're both trying to skewer in lots of ways. Babitz, not so much. Again, Babitz is just kind of having fun and making incredibly astute observations about humanity. Okay, in Play It As It Lays, we have this description of the ocean in California. Again, this tells us everything we need to know about Mariah's outlook. She drove to the beach, but there was oil scum on the sand and a red tide in the flaccid surf and mounds of kelp at the waterline. The kelp hummed with flies. The water lapped, warm, forceless. When she got back into town, she drove aimlessly down Sunset, pulled into a drive-in at the corner of La Brea, and, briefly flushed into purpose by a Coca-Cola, walked barefoot across the hot asphalt to a telephone booth. That is a masterclass in evoking a place. So not only have we covered a lot of ground, literally, here, it's the nuance and the complexity of this is incredible. So you've got, she's going to the beach. It's the Pacific Ocean, mind you, which is usually not so much in Southern California. It's a little more tame. But the Pacific is known for being kind of wild and crazy. She drives there, and you have the oil scum, which is, scum is such a great word for just the oil industry in general. But this is the era, when there would be like lots of tar on the beach. Like you would, my mom used to talk about she was born in Santa Barbara, coming home from the beach with tar all over your feet. There was lots and lots of oil scum on the sand, and a red tide, which is like lethal. I think that's the thing, like, where you're not supposed to get in the ocean. And I think it also makes all the, shellfish like toxic, in the flaccid surf. So I love the idea too of her bringing in flaccidity, even here when she's talking about the ocean, because of course there are several different men in this novel who are concerned about their drug-induced erectile dysfunction. So this idea of flaccidity is something that is kind of top of mind for Mariah. And then we have mounds of kelp at the waterline. The kelp hummed with flies. I mean, it is, everything about this beach visit is repellent. And that is partially because Mariah is stuck in this social environment that is toxic for her. She also doesn't have many places to go. This is actually a good segue to a quick aside, which is that one of the things that she does so well is that in this book, we have a very brief but very impactful allusion to Mariah's parents. So her father is the one who gave the title of the book, who taught her how to play craps, because her father owned a casino in Silver Wells, Nevada. But, at one point he says, she says, Silver Wells, Nevada, population 28, now 0. So you have this sense of ghost towns and boom and bust, and the West as being, sort of a shell of itself, and also of, a man like her father as having really come upon hard times. Then we find out that, in fact, her mother may have killed herself in a car crash. This is relatively early on in the book, so I'm not spoiling too much, I hope. And that she was in New York at the time and didn't find out about it until much later, because it happened on some highway out of like Tehachapi or Tonopah or somewhere. I apologize to Tehachapi and Tonopah. I'm sure they're not at all similar. I think they're both in Nevada. But anyway, but she didn't hear about it for a long time because the coyotes had eaten the body. Like, this is the kind of detail that we know about Mariah's parents. We don't, well, I'll get to Babitz's parents in a second, but we don't know anything about Alex's family. We don't know anything about her backstory. I kept thinking, maybe one of the things in the guests that we're going to get here is some indication for why Alex is so distanced from the world, and why she is so full of ennui and disillusionment, and why she is making literally the worst choices, like bad choice after bad choice after bad choice, and not just bad choices for herself, but bad choices that are really harmful for other people and a dog. Don't get me started. So anyway, you do have this sense of in Play It As It Lays of a real backstory that really explains everything. And not only is it a backstory that's very explanatory, but it's also just kind of like a whole novel unto itself. And it's, a couple of paragraphs in each case, but you have a sketching of a full life, or a full death, really, in this way that tells us everything we need to know about her parents and about her origin story. In Babitz, there's this excellent part where her parents are just really upset about Los Angeles because LACMA, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, is a travesty, and they don't fully appreciate Ivor Stravinsky, who also happens to be Eve Babitz's godfather. So you have this sense of her parents making this very quick cameo as these people who love Los Angeles, but also are completely they just think is despicable that the city doesn't have kind of more culture and that can't kind of get itself together. So again, you have this very quick cameo, but it is it's a very telling thing, and it also really informs so much about our protagonist. We are missing that in The Guest. Okay, after that whole digression about backstory, we are going to get to the third part, which is to talk about Slow Days, Fast Company and the evocation of Los Angeles in this book, which is unbelievable. So, I think most of you know this. I'm from Northern California, and Eve Babitz says, every serious affair, every serious kind of love affair, like sustained adult style love affair she had, was all in San Francisco. And it's like San Francisco's like some sort of like prison. Like, she comes up here and she feels so adult and wise and world weary and like kind of cozy in a good way, but basically like it's way too serious and kind of moral up here. And even though Los Angeles has its drawbacks, every time she goes there, she feels much more at home. I am generally not a huge fan of Los Angeles, but I will say that I have come to really appreciate it over the years. And Eve Babitz is one of the reasons why, because she really gives you a sense of how she has these amazing descriptions of both the Santa Anas and the torrential winds. She really embraces all of these incredible, sort of like natural, like crazy natural elements down there that I think really make her an unusual person and allow you actually to have a slightly different perspective on something like the Santa Anas. Okay. I'm going to read two quick things from Slow Days, Fast Company to give you a sense of the masterful way in which Babitz talks about Los Angeles. So the Irish writer from San Francisco is encouraging her to do more work, and she is just full of lethargy that she sort of blames on her surroundings. And it's kind of a delicious lethargy. Like, she's actually totally fine not working, and this Irish writer guy is just like, oh, like, you have to work, you have to work. Another quick aside, the audio version of Slow Days, Fast Company it's really pretty good. The woman who does it, at one point she does an Irish accent for this Irish writer guy, and it is not great. And I actually spent a lot of time rewinding and trying to understand what what other accent it sounded like to me, and I still don't fully have it, under control. But it was a very interesting kind of linguistic moment for me, but maybe not exactly the best Irish accent I have ever heard. Okay, so this is Eve Babitz's narrator talking about the Irish guy's advice. He'd never understand about the weather, that outside it's turned pink and the jacaranda tree is magenta, and next door the 14-year-old Mexican girl has finished her paper route and swung her long California-bred legs off her bike and now throws a frisbee at her brother's head expertly. It's so beautiful. So she just had gone through this whole thing about the bungalows where she lives and how they all look out onto this courtyard and then this jacaranda tree. She makes a quick aside that Nabokov said that if he lived in the United States, he would live in Los Angeles because of the jacaranda. Her descriptions of Los Angeles are just so beautiful. And I love that, this idea of this girl getting off of the bicycle with her long tanned legs and winging a frisbee at her brother's head, expertly. It's funny and it's light, but it does evoke a whole community and a whole kind of milieu that is in a physical surrounding that is so compelling. Okay, here's another description by Eve Babitz. This is at the beginning of a story called Rain. I say story because it does in some ways feel like a story collection, and yet there is definitely this through line that has everything to do with Los Angeles and also with this this recipient, this lover. So Rain is the name of this, and here's the first paragraph. When you feel as though you can't stand it another moment, that you'd rather be living in Siberia than go through another bleak stretch of parking lot days and smog, that you might even re-examine the possibility of San Francisco, where the view of the bay will always be before you in constant testimony to your adult wisdom. When all of that happens, it still doesn't rain. So an adage that I often mention to all you writers out there is that if you want an audience to love your character, you should show your character's weaknesses in addition to their strengths, but definitely, emphasize the weaknesses. So it's very compelling that Eve Babitz is not, she's not just like disregarding everyone's criticism of Los Angeles. She's very in tune with, the traffic and how gnarly that can be, and the different sort of, the heat and this idea of parking lot days and smog. And although she lots of times is talking about how beautiful the sunsets are because of the smog, but you do have this sense of kind of a really positive vision of Los Angeles, but also one that is kind of even-handed. Like she's giving you the whole thing, and she loves it even despite some of its shortcomings. So all of that is to say that there is a complexity with which she is describing this city and this place that we just don't really get in The Guest. So I want to read one more description from Eve Babitz because, again, it speaks to the breadth and also to the tone that is so different in her book than both the Didion and the Emma Cline. So she's talking about driving with one of her lovers into Kern County up into the mountains, sort of east of Los Angeles. Giant sequoias cast their green smell quickly through the car, and it all happened so fast, these abrupt California changes of altitude and landscape. The old school teacher thing about how California had the lowest point in the United States, Death Valley, only 80 miles away from the highest, Mount Whitney, came traipsing in from ancient classrooms. There is so much to love here. I mean, first of all, you have just the simple fact that you're like learning something. I am so embarrassed. I don't think that I knew that Mount Whitney, for some reason, I had Mount Whitney up in up in the Northeast, up in Washington. I don't know, again, I don't know who to blame that on. I'm just gonna geography in general. Maybe my memory, I'm sure someone taught me that at some point. So not only do you have this beautiful idea of it came traipsing in from ancient classrooms. So again, you have this incredible breadth. There's lots of intertexts in the Eve Babitz book. So she talks a lot about, not a lot, but a lot about literature. So she mentioned Nabokov wanting to move to LA, but she talks about Proust and Henry James and Jane Austen and all of these different writers in a sort of these organic, excellent ways. It's not name droppy. It's always always very effective, and it feels very sort of given and like easy, but it does add again to this depth and breadth. But it also it gives us like a little bit of a timelessness here, like this idea of something traipsing in from ancient classrooms feels very old, and it feels very like it's a very kind of not archaic exactly, but we have this very modern book that is in some ways it's reaching backward in time in a way that I find just totally irresistible. Okay, in order to just wrap everything up, I want to just end with the idea that I I really don't mean to be too harsh about the guest, but I believe that reading is important, and I believe that the way that the things that we read can really change us, and they can really again, be very informative in terms of how we are viewing the world and how we are moving through the world. And I wow, the guest, like if that's indicative, I'm just not sure what to make of it. I think today was kind of a chance for me to wrestle with what it was that was so hard for me to read. And I think, it was very bleak, and it didn't satisfy enough of my kind of curiosity. And to be very clear, also, I am not someone who needs to like all the characters. I love television where everybody's behaving badly, and Lolita is one of my favorite books of all time, and it's literally the story of a psychopath just committing terrible, terrible crimes. So I am not someone who, in fact, I'm someone who's not very interested in likable characters. So it wasn't that I wanted a likable narrator. It's simply that I didn't understand her, and I didn't understand what I was meant to take away. I like to think that like the drug use and all of the sort of vicissitudes and the trials and tribulations were not glamorized, but I'm a little bit worried that they were. And if they weren't meant to be glamorized, I'm just not sure what we were meant to take away from it. It wasn't sort of enough of a skewering of the ultra wealthy. The inconclusive nature of the ending was totally fine to me. And in fact, it didn't actually seem very inconclusive. I felt like I knew, what we were meant to take away at the ending there. But it wasn't very satisfying in the sense of, and again, I don't want a lesson. I don't want morals all kind of wrapped in a bow. And certainly, these other two novels that we've been discussing are not like overly optimistic. They're not teaching us anything, and they're not trying to moralize. But even Play It As It Lays ends on a hopeful note. It does. And as does the Babitz. So I'm concerned. I'm concerned about, I'm hoping that literature has some power, and I'm concerned about this, sort of thinking that the guest is on par with these books that for me are much richer and much more rewarding and much more kind of edifying in terms of literature, but also in terms of the messages that one is taking away. So thank you for tuning in, and check back to the Vox page to learn more about Babitz, because I'm going to have a whole entire lecture about Slow Days, Fast Company, and who knows? Maybe we'll have to dig back into Play It As It Lays, which we did back in the bookstore a million years ago. Or maybe I'll have to dig in further to The Guest. There's certainly a lot to recommend that book, and certainly a lot that I could dig into. But what I really wanted to do was kind of make sense in my mind of this comparison of these three writers. And hopefully that's been interesting for you too. Happy reading.